There are quite a few techniques I want to show you right now for working with not only dynamic population, but with regular population and standard population. Also some different ways to manage the size of scene files, optimizing the file as much as possible. And in this scene, I have a procedural terrain that is layered on top of a standard terrain. It's one constant terrain, but was mostly designed as a standard terrain and then procedural overlaid on top of that. The material is a combination of a couple of texture maps along with some procedurals and some layers. Now the ecosystem is already set up on the material for this terrain, and I have some different settings and controls for the size of the instances and offset. But when I save the file, I don't want to have a direct population within the scene unless I've painted or customized any area of it. Anytime the scene is populated, it's going to massively increase the file size. So if you're using dynamic population, that's not typically an issue because that's cleared out before the scene is saved, and that's not going to be part of the file. But if I was to manually populate this, and we have a rather large scene now, a lot of instances, what's going to happen is saving this file, it's going to go from somewhere around 10 megs to a couple of hundred. So if you're saving frequently, which you should be, it's going to take a long time to save a file with this sort of ecosystem. And if you're creating backup copies as well, which you can do automatically, file options, you can set up numbered backups. And I usually have this set to 3. And I was fortunate enough to have my CPU chiller cut out on me in the middle of one of the previous lessons. So all of my Vue settings are reset to default and not all back to normal yet. So I might be changing a few things here and there to get them back while I'm working on this. But basically what we want to do is minimize the amount of ecosystems having to be saved with the scene, especially for defined areas. Anytime we paint any part of the ecosystem, that has to be saved within the file. That population needs to stay static, otherwise we're going to lose that information. And that includes painted parts of the ecosystem within the ecosystem layer, and also anything part of the ecosystem painter. And this ecosystem is roughly 128,000 instances of the population, and I really only want to define a couple areas. So what I want to do is set up an animation, kind of a camera fly-through, to focus more on one specific part of the terrain towards the end of the animation. I'm going to start by clearing out the ecosystem because I don't have anything really defined yet. And this is going to speed up the workflow for setting up the keyframes. I'm going to go ahead and hit F11 and the animation wizard's coming up. Once again, all my defaults reset. So I'm going to turn off the display and just close that out. I'm going to turn off the auto keyframing. I want to set this up manually. I don't want any unwanted frames showing up in the animation. That can cause certain issues within Vue. There are a few problems with camera animation, jittering and whatnot. So we're going to set up some manual keyframes for the camera. The first thing I want to do is create a duplicate of the camera that I currently have. And I did previously have a camera 2, which I deleted, so the next camera that's showing up is camera 3. And whenever you're using the save or duplicate camera option, it is going to change some of the graph settings, which we'll be taking a look at a little bit later. So I want to create about a 5 or 6 second animation. What we can do is expand the timeline view, holding down Control on the keyboard, and then if you right click and then move the mouse up or down, you can scale. If you right click, you can pan the timeline, and that way we can keep everything in view or shown. So I'm going to start by selecting the camera 1, and what we're going to do is create a position keyframe, an orientation keyframe, and a focal keyframe. And for the camera, making sure that the lock height option is turned off, which is shown right here next to height. That will lock the camera at a certain height above the objects that are underneath it, and that can cause some issues with what we're doing right now. So I'm not going to be using that. And I also have the keep camera level option turned off, which is up here on the top. Now I want to give myself a little bit of padding to work with, because I don't want to start rendering at frame 0. I want to make sure it's a little bit into the animation a little further. I'm going to go ahead and bring this over to 7 seconds. Now we can change the keyframes anytime, moving, positioning them differently. I'm just going to change the timeline to 7 seconds, and what I want to do is kind of move the camera around to this area over here. So I'm going to start by first getting the camera to its ending position, and then creating the in-between frames after the initial position change has been made. So I'm just moving the camera with the mouse and the scroll, also holding down Shift and right click to move the camera up and down or left and right, changing the position. And then we can use the camera control center to create more fine-tuned movement, because the scroll on the mouse might be a little too dramatic. If you ever need to slow down the controls within the control center, if you hold down Control while you're clicking, it'll give you a more precise slowed down movement, so that can be pretty helpful. Because sometimes you really do have to use the control center in order to get accurate movement. So now that we have this set, I'm going to add a position and orientation keyframe. And I haven't changed the focal, so I'm not going to worry about changing the focal just yet. I may end up zooming in, not sure just yet. And Vue has already managed to change exactly where I had the camera in the beginning. So if we take a look, going back to that duplicate, that's quite a large change between the two. So that's another reason why it's a good idea to save the other camera. But what I want to do right now before I make any more modifications is open up the camera 3 graph, and because of the way this was copied, the dependencies are set to the original camera. In this case, the main camera, and those input nodes were not updated when I created the duplicate. That's a bug right now in the version I'm using. Hopefully it's fixed in a future version. If not, just make sure that you change some of these settings to be correct. So when we're in camera 3 position, go to the orientation, camera 3 orientation, and those are going to be the main settings. Going over to the focal as well, making sure that is camera 3. focal. And now we're going to switch over to camera 1, open the graph, set up the same options. Camera 1 position, camera 1 orientation, camera 1 focal. Just so that's not causing any problems. And now we're going to move over to the numerics tab for camera 1, then switching over to camera 3 so we can copy over the information from camera 3, our original stored camera, for the first keyframe. So we can just select the numbers in there, Control-C to copy, switch the camera, and then we're going to need to add the position keyframe. And we might have to do that throughout. It might be easier to create the first keyframe with auto keyframing if that's becoming an issue. But I do like to set manual keyframes and not have anything else keyframed that is not going to be changing, because Vue does have a few issues. And then we can update, go over to the other frame for Z. And it would probably be simpler to just create a text file, a temporary text file, and copy and paste all of that into the file, and then from there you can copy and paste them all in, so that way you don't have to keep switching back. So I'm just going to go back to camera 3 and grab the orientation vectors and just do the same thing, copying and pasting them over to camera 1. So now that is showing up properly for the first frame, or the first keyframe setup. I do need to make some modifications. Now normally I animate my cameras in Vue with Camera Orbiter, which is a tool I designed. So it creates a really nice animation. Just using 2 keyframes, you can create a very smooth camera motion. But I do want to show you how you can do this manually. I'm just going to go ahead and scrub through the animation to around what would be the halfway point, and do want to pull the camera back a little and change the orientation. So we're going to stop at 317 and just make some adjustments to the camera. Just kind of moving this around. We can fine-tune the actual position of the keyframes after we've created them. That's not going to be all that difficult. And then once we have the position and orientation we want, we need to set up position keyframe, orientation keyframe, and that should be all we need, hopefully. And I'll just have to go in and kind of tweak the way this is set up, because it's not really transitioning very well. We could also make some adjustments to the curves and showing the properties. So this way we can see, select the position, and now we can see the curve for these keyframes. So I'm going to go ahead and take the Y and just kind of adjust the graph a little, or the curve. And we just want to smooth this out along with the current frames. I'm going to undo that last bit. Now if you right click on these, you can also get other options for the blending. Right now it's set to custom, so we have kind of a visor spline. what we can do is change these to smooth or set up numeric input. There's a lot of different options you can choose from. There's also curve options to adjust layout settings, things like that. I'm going to go over to the orientation, and it's going to ask me if I want to basically reset the entire animation for the orientation. And this is so that I can modify the graph. I'm going to click yes. And I can already see not only has the position changed quite a bit from the orientation, we can just go make some changes here. I'm going to start with the graph, and if you want to view one specific vector, x, y, or z, to automatically zoom to that area to see it a little bit better, you could just click on that within the properties. It does make it a little bit easier. So we can go through one by one, x, y, z, and just update that. And it's starting to look a little bit smoother. I might need to really adjust the ending there because we have it kind of shooting forward. So what I can do in order to prevent that from happening is to take these keyframes down the center and move them over a little bit and shift them. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of tweak the animation a little so we can take a look at the ecosystem techniques. I do want to show you, if you do want to shift the entire group, you can just grab the main keyframe that we have all of these properties keyframe to. So we want to move this over to the left to reduce that massive zoom where it's sped up a little bit too much. If we were to increase it to the right, we would increase the speed by reducing the time between those keyframes. So if you need to make any sort of an adjustment, kind of smooth that out. Just kind of scrubbing through and paying attention to how that's going to look. And I'm just going to be changing the initial starting point. And I don't have my frame guides on right now, so the extent of the animation and the full frame, I just kind of have to keep that in mind. It is cutting it off on the sides quite a bit. And I just added an orientation keyframe, which did kind of mess things up. So I'm going to undo just that operation, because otherwise it's going to reset the camera further. That should be good overall. Otherwise we can just modify the graph and kind of change the vector. So we're going to start with that. And if I want to fine-tune this a little further, I really don't want this to be such a straight animation at this point. Once we're reaching this area, I want to kind of move the camera around a little bit more, but I'll tweak that a little bit later. So now what I want to do is just go ahead and populate the ecosystem to take a look and kind of see which areas we'll need to separate from the rest, or from the dynamic population, and whatever is going to be defined. So basically this area here, I want to be able to separate from the dynamic population so that I can go in and paint on some of these areas, but still be able to use dynamic population for the rest of the scene. So if we take a look in the top view, we should be able to see the camera's path. We'll go ahead and select the camera. And we have this really large area of the scene that's not even being used. So we really wouldn't need to have, or wouldn't want, any sort of static population in that area. But we do need to pull out basically this sunken in area here. So what I want to do is go back to frame 0, and then I'm going to create, or go over to that duplicate camera from before, or we can go over to the top camera. Just one that isn't animated is going to be the most important part. So I'm going to store camera 3 to create camera 4, which is going to be the backup of 3. And now use camera 3 in order to set up what's going to be a camera mapped projection of the defining area. So now we can position camera 3 to be able to see that area. And it looks like I'm going to go ahead and check the graph and just make sure that everything is still remaining intact. So we want kind of a top view. Want to minimize some of the perspective. And really just keeping in mind what is going to show up within the shot and where we need to have either higher resolution ecosystem instances, some static plants rather than using the Vue vegetation, which is really kind of one of the major purposes of this, is to be able to define a highly detailed zone, to be able to go in and paint smaller plants in, or even just define and customize this part of the ecosystem. So I also want to use a higher focal for this, and what I want to do is change this over to maybe 80. It looks like I'm having a little bit of trouble here being able to click on it and change the number. I think that's part of the recording interface, so I'm just going to go ahead and do this manually, just kind of bring it up a little further. Just so we can see the shot, and the more we increase the focal, the more we're going to remove perspective from the shot, because we do want it to be as flat as possible. And this way we can also use this camera to either paint a matte for the terrain and project that texture onto it, or customize other options that way. So I'm going to go to File and Options and just make sure that I'm going to show all of the different cameras. So show all cameras and views. It should show the camera coming in. It doesn't look like it's showing up. So maybe that's not going to apply to that area. Either that or I'm in the wrong spot. But I'm pretty sure that was set up correctly. So let's just go over into the top view, which I'm currently in. And we can see the camera. Probably pretty difficult for you to see. It is right here, just moving through the zone. So that is set up in the right spot. It just looks like the main camera view is not showing all the cameras, and there might be a setting for that. I am going to reposition this camera because it was slightly offset. And it looks like there's a few problems. It looks like maybe the pivot is off a little. So I'm going to select the pivot position and go ahead and reset the pivot. And then go into the graph and make sure that the pivot, if it's loaded in there, because we do have a pivot offset, which may not be part of the first. And it looks like we also have a giant duplicate list of all of these input nodes. That might be causing some issues. So we may have to set up kind of a manual vector in order to get that to work. So we'll just kind of reposition this manually using the control center and also just the mouse. We'll start out there. And what I want to do is, instead of just using the complete range of this camera, I instead want to just render out a very quick frame of the position and just kind of go into Photoshop and create what would be a mask. And then we can use that to switch back and forth and control these different ecosystems, both the painted material and then the global ecosystem as well. So for this, what I'm going to end up doing is clearing out the ecosystem. And it might be easier to work with a square aspect for the render and for the matte. We're creating the mask. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to the square aspect ratio. And then we can move the camera in or increase the focal. So if we also need to show the frame guides, we turn that back on, showing the framing strips, so we can see exactly where it is we're going to be rendering. Now, in this situation, we might be able to use a different technique if we don't want to go into Photoshop or don't need to. What I'm going to do is add in another ground plane. And what I can do is just scale the ground plane to intersect with the terrain. And if you go to the render options and take a look at the hide infinite planes from alpha, what we would do is render a frame and take the alpha to create the mask, which is going to be a much quicker solution rather than going in and painting it. So if you can adjust that with the elevation, if that's the zone you're defining, or at least just with a starting point, that can work quite well. So what I'm going to do is just take this infinite plane, which does have the same material as the terrain because it was the object selected before, and that's the settings that I have on. So I'm going to right-click, reset the material on the infinite plane. It really doesn't matter what material is on it. We just wanted something very basic. So we can adjust this to kind of cut out the area that we want to define further. And if you're having overlaps in some of the areas that you don't want to define, you could just clean that up later. So even if you are going to be painting this in, either way, this can certainly help speed up any painting time. So I want this to be a pretty decent resolution, just because the way the texture map interpolation types will work around the edges might interfere with the density that we're going to be controlling for the population. So we will want to have a fairly decent size. I'm going to go ahead and set this up to 2000 by 2000. If we need to go much larger, we can, but just for this density alpha, it doesn't need to be huge. It doesn't even need to be full frame, just enough to define the zone and kind of cut it out. So with the hide infinite plane from alpha, we can also If you really wanted something very quick, go to the user setting, turn off apply materials, and just turn off all of the settings. Texture anti-aliasing, keep on the object anti-aliasing. You can set up something custom if you want. 416 should be okay. And I'm just going to render this to the screen for now. So here we can see the color render output. And if we switch over to the alpha, we can see that whole area cut out already. So we could use this, but I do want to clean it up a bit. Basically just filling in this area on the lower left, and then cutting this in a little bit on the right. If needed, I could also shift the camera over a little to reposition that. But this should be okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save out the alpha. I don't need the color at all. And I'm going to call this population mask and save it as a PNG file, which should be a really small file size. And now I have it opened up within Photoshop. It's only a 55K file, so it's really quite small. It is going to save in the indexed mode, which is typically not going to be entirely suitable for this. So we're going to switch it over to grayscale rather than using an indexed color, which is it does have advantages. It does remove any other colors. Basically, it's used typically web format with GIFs. Not really going to be using it too often for these scenes. So depending on the format you save it in, it may or may not save an indexed. I know it does for the bitmap files, PNG. In TIFF format, I don't believe it uses an indexed color. So then what we can do is just paint in and fill in those areas. It's also a good idea to remove some of these smaller elements just because they may cause issues. So just kind of painting over them can be really helpful. And now I'm just going to go into my brush, shape, and remove the spacing, bringing it down to 1% so that we have a much smoother brush out of that. So we can just go around, and I'm just using my mouse right now. Wacom currently not plugged in. So we can just go through and just remove any of those really, really fine details. In some cases, they're going to be helpful, but we just don't want to have too much of a spotted population unless you really have a very specific area that you need to define. And now I'm going to cut in a little bit on this side and just kind of paint that in. And I don't need to worry about it being too conforming to the terrain because of the way this is going to turn out. So that should be acceptable and work as our mask. You do want to make sure that you're not cropping at all, unless you want to adjust the aspect of the camera and set all that up again. It's just going to be easier to stick with a square. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this out and just overwriting the file